In our society, liberty is the norm, and detention prior to trial or without trial is the carefully limited exception. It has become, unfortunately, in practice, the norm, as we've seen so many articles and reports of late. Money bail fails to distinguish between those who are the most dangerous and those who are low risk, but it easily distinguishes between those who have money and those who don't. Each year in New York City, 50,000 people go to Rikers because they can't afford bail. And New York State's own chief judge has called the system ass backwards. And I quote, ass backwards. So we also know that there's a lot of things that happen to you when you're held before trial, some of which Peter already mentioned, some of which have to do with the indignity and dangers of jail itself. But we also know that people who are held before trial have worse outcomes to their cases. They get longer sentences, they get less favorable plea deals, they're more likely to plead guilty to crimes that they didn't commit, and perhaps most importantly, they are more likely to commit new crimes. So we think we're putting people in jail. New York is a little bit weird on this, but in most places we think we're holding people in jail before trial to protect the public. In fact, we may be increasing the crime that's out there. That's a word called criminogenic that I like. The New York Times Magazine recently wrote that ensuring that no one is held in jail based on poverty would, in many respects, necessitate a complete reordering of criminal justice. The open secret is that in most jurisdictions, bail is the grease that keeps the gears of the overburdened system turning. So tonight we have some very distinguished guests with us to help enlighten us on the mysteries of bail. Right to my left here is Lynne Martin, a longtime advocate of criminal justice reform, founder of JustLeadershipUSA, which is dedicated to cutting the incarcerated population in half by 2030. You've probably heard of that effort. Mr. Martin, who spent 6 years in New York State prisons, has spent years advocating for prisoners and easing their reentry and fighting for alternatives to incarceration. He also serves on Governor Cuomo's Reentry and Reintegration Council and has written elegantly for news outlets, including my own, where he recently said, "Our growing calls for reform have yet to be translated into measurable shifts in practice. In the meantime, many of our neighbors are serving life in jail on the installment plan." Next, we have the Honorable George Grasso, who served for more than 3 decades in the NYPD, rising to first Deputy Police Commissioner in 2002 before embarking on a second career as a jurist. In 2012, he became acting Supreme Court Justice and the supervising judge of arraignments. I think the New York Post called him the lone arraigner, where he applied a CompStat-like system to bring the system into compliance with the rule that you're supposed to arraign people who get arrested within 24 hours. Remember, all of the people who have been arrested are legally innocent. Some of them were being held for much longer than that. And he just took apart the system and put it back together to get it much closer to that 24-hour deadline. And he's also designed innovative programs for young defendants, is co-chair of the Committee for the Mayor's Behavioral Health Task Force, which recently recommended Supervised Release program, and hopefully he'll talk about that for appropriate misdemeanor and felony cases. Next, we have Josh Saunders, a graduate of NYU Law. He has been a public defender since 2006, working primarily in Brooklyn and the Bronx. He is, among other things, a co-founder of the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund, and he seems to live in Seattle now.
It's got too hot for me.
And lastly, we have Miguel Padilla. Miguel is a former client of Brooklyn Defender Services. He was a client, unfortunately came a little too early for the bail fund, and so we're about to hear from him about the consequences of that. He grew up in the Bronx and currently resides in Tampa, Florida, where he lives with his wife and 3 children. And he works at Steak and Shake with Stephanie. Before losing his job because of an arrest, he worked at Target. So, Miguel, I think you have the first person experience, the first person account. Can you tell us what happened to you?
Well,
I'm sorry. Can I everyone knows, each panelist is going to speak for about 5 minutes. After about 4 minutes, I'm going to start coughing and awkwardly beeping. And then we'll have time for some back and forth and some questions from the audience.
okay. Well, it all started just trying to help out my brother-in-law, and we had a big party, and he was drinking, and he wanted to drive some of the family members home. So I took it upon myself, which I wasn't drinking that night, to drive, and I drove into Brooklyn, and we dropped off some family members. Didn't know I was driving with a busted taillight, and we got pulled over. And I got arrested for a suspended license, and got taken in, and I was in Rikers. I got put into Rikers, and I was there for about a week, and I went through a lot, like, in that process, because I couldn't see my family. I couldn't speak to my family. I didn't know if my family knew what was going on with me. I went through a lot of hazing, a lot of people trying to initiate me into a gang that I wasn't even a part of. I went through a lot of physical and mental abuse, like even with the CO officers and all the other inmates. It's a lot. People see it from the outside in, and they say, "Oh, it's jail. It's nothing." Well, it's not nothing. It's your life you're playing with. I mean, it's the little bit of time I was there, it just took a whole lot away from me. It took my jobs. I had 2 jobs before this, paying rent, paying bills with my family, and that took everything away from me, everything. And it literally broke my heart. Like I said it in the video. I don't know if everybody's seen the video, but I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy.
It's mood music to go along with your story.
Romance.
Yeah, it's just really rough, and I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, on anyone, because what I went through, I wouldn't want anyone to go through. It's really hard, especially from the transaction of having to plead guilty just so I can come home, because I couldn't afford a $1,000 bail. You know, my poor wife, she tried to raise as much money as she could. All she did was raise $250. But at least she tried, you know, and I appreciated every second of it, you know. But even from the time of my release, what I went through, it was tremendous. It was snowing. I got sent home in a T-shirt and open-toe shoes. You know, it was rough. It was rough. And part of the reason why I pled guilty was because I wanted to come home, and I wanted to be with my family. Like, I'm a family man. This is who I am. I'm a provider, and I had that all taken away from me. And now I reside in Florida. I decided I didn't want to be here anymore. So I picked up and I left my family, and it took me a year, all because of the charges I have on my record now, just to find a job. And, you know, thank God. And
A year because you had a driving while suspended charge on your record.
Yes.
To find a job.
And now, you know, pleading guilty to the charge, it gave me a criminal record. And, you know, in Florida, they don't play. They do a thorough background check. So it took a year. Oh, well, a little before a year, but close to a year before I actually found my first job. And I'm glad to say now, you know, everything's great. Still have my beautiful wife and children. and I'm working 2 jobs, so I'm just thankful to be here and be able to talk to everybody and let everyone know on my experience.
Miguel, what jobs did you have when you got arrested? Target, and what was the other one?
I was working Target, and I was working for a supermarket called Western Beef.
And what did they say when you came back? Did you ask for your old job back?
I tried to get my job back. They didn't know what happened, and I tried to explain to my bosses what happened as discreetly as I could, and they weren't trying to hear it. They thought I was just out partying and taking advantage of just, not showing up to work. So, and to think I worked for these companies for a few years, and I've never given them an excuse to fire me. Like, as far as taking days off, I was always to work every day on time. So it was just, to try to get my job back and, well, basically beg for my job back, and for them to tell me no, it was heartbreaking.
And how do you think your case would have been different if you had $1,000 in your pocket when they set your bail?
If I would have had the money, I probably would have still had my job and not had the criminal record that I have now. And that's probably about it.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm just going to go down the row here. So, Josh, do you want to deliver your manifesto?
I shall.
All right.
I'll stand on top of the table. Thanks for having me. Thank you for not having a hurricane. I totally appreciate that. That didn't seem that fun. So I've been a public defender for almost a decade now, I guess, mostly at Brooklyn Defender Services, but also at the Bronx Defenders. And I was trying to figure this out the other day. I think I've handled like between 5,000 and 7,000 cases in my career, something like that. Most of us typically carry a caseload of about 100 cases at any given time. That's maybe something like 400 or 500 over the course of a year. So, and of those cases, the vast majority of them are misdemeanors. The vast majority of arrests in New York City are misdemeanors, and the majority of the cases that we carry are misdemeanors. I think probably something like between 70 and 80% of the cases that I've handled have been misdemeanors. And I want to talk about my interest in bail, I think, or introduce my interest in bail by talking about one of those misdemeanor cases. So this was a case that I had, I think maybe in my second year of practice, a man who I'm going to call Mr. Jacob, which is not his name. And he was in his late 60s. He had a very serious illness. He lived in a SRO, which is a single residence occupancy, which is sort of a step up from a shelter, if anyone doesn't know that. And he had a fairly lengthy criminal record. I'd say he had something like 45 misdemeanors on his record. He had no felonies on his record. He had no crimes of violence. And his record reflected a history of struggling, I think, with addiction and poverty, frankly. And he was accused of stealing 2 shirts and a pair of pants, I think, from a store in Fulton Mall, value of something like $50. So I talked to him in the back, and he tells me about some of these things, and I tell him that he's likely to receive an offer on his case from the district attorney and possibly from the judge. And we go in front of the judge, and district attorney says, "All right, judge, the people's offer is 60 days jail." And I said to him, "I don't think you should take this offer because I think that we can get a better offer somewhere down the line." And he talks to me about how he's going to lose his place in his SRO. He's concerned about having access to his medications at Rikers and all sorts of things that a lot of people need to survive, right? Shelter and medicine. And I said to him, I know, I understand those things, and I'm going to do my best to get you out of here, but the truth of the matter is I think this judge will probably set bail on you. So that's what happened. The judge set bail. The judge set $500 bail, and he doesn't take the 60 days. And so typically what happens is if that happens to you in the case of a misdemeanor, your next court date is about 5 days later. And I came back on that day, and I went to the courtroom where I expected to have his case called, and he's sitting on a bench outside of the courtroom. And he's wearing a button-up shirt, and he's wearing clean pants, and he looks great and looks healthy, at least a heck of a lot healthier than when I had seen him behind bars, right? And I said, Mr. Jacob, I'm really glad to see you. I'm surprised and happy to see that you are not in jail. And it turned out that he'd been sent to a drug court and that he'd been released by a judge there who, for a while, had the habit of releasing people who were accused of property crimes in a very kind way. So I call his case. We go into the courtroom, and we're standing in front of the judge, and the district attorney says, Judge, the people's offer is 60 days, right? Saying that it had been in arraignments. And incidentally, this is absolutely not a knock on this district attorney or any district attorney. This particular DA is a person that I think is very thoughtful and, frankly, a very humane attorney. So he says, people's offer is 60 days, and he turns to me and to look at me and my client to see if we want it. And he says, oh, your guy is out. And I said, yeah, he's out. And he turns back to the judge, and he says, Judge, we'll amend our offer. People's offer is a misdemeanor and time served, right? And so we take it, right? So we take it. And, and I tell the story to illustrate what I came to see as a real sort of maxim of public defense work in my first few years of practice, which is that a person who is out tends to stay out, and a person who is in tends to stay in. And I found that in the case particularly of misdemeanors, and I think that's really what we're talking about here, particularly in the case of misdemeanors, the fundamental variable in that question of whether a person is in or out is bail. And the fact that there was such a radical disparity, in my mind, between not only a disposition in a particular case, because in a lot of cases, someone who's out, not only do they not plead guilty to jail time, they don't plead guilty to a crime. Right? They plead guilty to a violation, or they plead guilty to a misdemeanor, they do 3 days of community service, and they come back and their disposition is reduced to a violation. Or, in many instances, their cases get dismissed, like they have in roughly 50% of the bail funds cases. So, to see that disparity, and to my mind, really that disparity was about someone's ability to pay $250 or $500. And that struck me as an obscenity on some level. I don't
All right,
think
thank you.
that.
Your time is up.
So I didn't like it. That's what it comes down to.
Judge Grasso. I know I don't really have any unsubtle way of. You guys have to pay attention to me.
All right.
Can you make the music go again?
Yeah.
Well, the timer's going,
All right.
so I better get ready.
No, I just started you. You're
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, it's great to be here tonight. I think this is really the right discussion at the right time, and to see the interest that we have here, I think underlines that. Next month, I will be 36 years in the criminal justice system. Started out as a police officer in 1979 and left the police department to become a judge in 2010. 5 years as a judge in King's Criminal Court, the last year in Bronx Criminal Court. So I've seen a lot of iterations of our criminal justice system, and obviously it's been my professional life to stay attuned to what's been happening in our city. When I became a police officer, we were at about 1,100 to 1,200 homicides in New York, which today would be unthinkable, fortunately. But we were actually just getting started. By 1990, we hit about 2,300 homicides. Then, by last year, we're in the lower 300 range, which is still too many, but when you look at it in a historical context, New York City is actually at an apex of public safety that is really comparable to the entire 20th century right now. Therefore, this is the perfect time to be having this conversation, for us to take a half a step back and think about bail and think about other issues impacting the fairness in our criminal justice system as to what can we do better, how can we be more just. So in that regard, I think Judge Jonathan Littman really hit the heart of this bail issue this past Thursday. I think he used the term Alice in Wonderland, that we have a system, as some of our panelists have already, to punishment first, verdict later. Too many people in jail, far too many people in jail who really pre-trial, who pose no threat to society. Without waiting for the state legislature to act, we can and we must make substantive changes to this system, and we really can start moving and should start moving now. The first thing, however, I think, is we should think about this. We should ask ourselves, what is the primary purpose of our criminal justice system? Do we want a system that is based primarily on the concept of punishment or primarily on the concept of justice? What is the best way to manage a system that processes tens of thousands of people every year who live well below the poverty line and routinely deal with a myriad of substance abuse issues, transient housing, inadequate medical care? Are there viable alternatives to bail and jail for those who manage to repeatedly churn through the system? The Chief Judge of the State of New York believes there are, as do I, and I think many of the people here this evening believe that as well. We are in the process right now of expanding supervised release for indigent defendants charged with misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies that will use a risk assessment instrument and focus on linking defendants with appropriate services and a contact regimen in lieu of cash bail. We release people on their recognizance. They agree to a certain service regimen, or at least to be assessed, and a certain contact protocol, and then we release them on their recognizance in return for that. That's what we're working on expanding right now through Mayor de Blasio's Behavioral Health Task Force. I happen to be a co-chair of a subcommittee that recommended that. Judge Lippman's stated plan to implement a bail review procedure in each of our criminal courts will both encourage the use of supervised release while operating as a mechanism to utilize other alternatives to cash bail, such as partially secured bonds processed at the courthouse in lieu of relying on bail bond companies. As to felonies,
1 minute.
the implementation of new court rules requiring periodic judicial review of bail through status conferences has great promise. But in the end, for all of these reforms to have their desired effect, all of the components of the criminal justice system should re-examine our underlying philosophy. Coerciveness, applied for the sake of coerciveness, is a punitive framework that not only leads to injustice for individuals, but in the long run is at odds with public safety. Careful application of Judge Lippman's fair-minded and common-sense reforms, combined with expanded and properly executed use of supervised release, will go a long way to re-emphasizing the criminal justice system's primary focus, justice. Thank you.
I'm on.
You're on. Please,
great.
Mr. Martin.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Lynne Martin. I'm the founder and president of an organization called JustLeadershipUSA. In some ways, I'm going to build off of the things that Miguel said because I was on Rikers, but many, many years ago. And when I listen to Miguel's story, it just confirms for me that we have at least a couple of decades of human carnage under our belt. When I went to Mayor de Blasio's inauguration, I had a chance to stand online to take a picture with him like most other people who were there. And when I got up to our new mayor online that day, I said to him, you know, with all due respect, Mr. Mayor, I can take a picture with you at any time. I'm here to tell you that you should close down Rikers Island. And he looked at me and said, why? And what I said to him was many of the things that are being said here on this panel today, maybe even a bit more forcefully. And it's because the year I spent on Rikers over 20 years ago confirmed a couple of things for me. One, that we lock up some of America's best and brightest, and we lie about it. Two, that Rikers is a place that causes not just physical damage to people, but significant emotional damage and trauma. I have 3 stab wounds to my own body, 1 here in my neck and 2 in my back, that came from spending time on Rikers Island, because it is a place that often is a powder keg. And you might ask, well, isn't that residence on residence violence? Because that's the way it's often painted, particularly by the head of the union, Norman Seabrook. But the truth is, in my experience, the officers that are there to protect people often decide that instead of doing their own job, that they'll identify a couple of the people who are serving time to mete out punishment and keep order on the cell block and on the dorm, which creates a very dangerous situation for anyone entering into our jail system who wants to just be neutral, stay out of trouble, get out, go home, take care of their family. And so it's a difficult place to survive for anyone. And the thing about Rikers is that it's the culture, right? So there is no reforming Rikers Island. We should get rid of Rikers Island, decentralize our jail, hold officers accountable, bring programs back to the city, to the city's jails, and get rid of cash bail. Because we don't get there unless we get rid of cash bail. When I was on Rikers, there were 23,000 people there. The facility is meant to hold 15,000, and even then, that was with temporary facilities. Currently, while the number is much lower, the cost has gone up considerably, $167,000 per bed per year. But even back then, the majority of people that were there with very low bail, usually under $2,000. But as someone who grew up here in Brooklyn, extremely poor, single-parent household, 3 brothers on public assistance, you set $500 bail or you set $200,000 bail, it's all ransom to me. And that was the case for many of the other people that I met while I was there on Rikers. It is a very hot place, or cold, depending on the time of year. It is a place that is crowded, that is devoid of programming. It is a place that can be dangerous to the residents. And when I was there, it was a place where if you walked into a cell block or a dorm, you had to make a pretty quick decision about whether you wanted to be the aggressor or the person who was taken advantage of. And so the reason I say all this is that I'm trying to paint a picture for people who will never have a chance to go on Rikers. And you're speaking to someone who's been back to Rikers many times since then. I was just there a few months ago to serve as keynote speaker for the GED graduation. And even then, you had 48 young people graduating, and you had 30 officers standing around them with their arms crossed, with their backs turned to them, to send a strong message to their family. So I paint this picture so that anyone who never has a chance to go there understand what it looks like, what it feels like, and the fact that everyone in this room is responsible for having a torture island just off LaGuardia Airport. We're all responsible. We all own it. It exists in our name, and it exists in our mayor's name. And we have a choice. It's not the first time someone has said out loud we should close down Rikers. The former commissioner, on his way out, 40 years in correction, parole, probation. You know what he said, Martin Horn? He said, in my entire career, the one regret that I have was that no matter how much I invested, I wasn't able to change the culture on Rikers one bit. And to me, when the person who's leading the island says that, and that we should close it down, it's time for us to have a serious conversation about closing it down, and bail reform is a big part of how we get there.
So I have a judge on the hot seat, so I'm going to ask you some questions about how do you set bail when you were presiding? What was your reasoning? What went through your head? Why use money bail?
Basically, I just remanded. That was only a joke. Well, look, what you do is you have something called the Criminal Justice Agency. They have a tool. And they give you a rating, between 0 and 12. And actually, they can go into the negatives as to whether or not someone is a good bet for bail. They look at everything like
12 being good,
being good,
super good,
negative being bad. And they'll look at warrant history is obviously a very big area. If someone has a warrant history, they lose a lot of points. Community contacts, whether they're employed, whether they have a working phone, things like that. So you got the CJA. Obviously, you got the charges. You're looking at a disorderly conduct. You're looking at a homicide. You've got a rap sheet, where you can see the person's criminal history in New York State contacts and out-of-state contacts. And in a very tight scenario, you're listening, you're looking at the docket, you're reading the complaint, you're reading the rap sheet, you're looking at the CJA, you're hearing the people go first, you hear the prosecutor, and then you listen to the defense, and you try and make the best decision you can. That's basically what's going on.
And why don't judges use more of the alternative forms of bail that are available?
Well, that's a great question, and it's something that Judge Littman hit right on. Frankly, we need more training in the court system. Not only do the judges need the training, but the court clerks, who prepare the paperwork for the judges in the court, they need to be trained up in that. So the most common types of bail are cash bail, the money bail, and the bail bond. So we've got all of these other types. There's like 7 other types of bail that's provided for in state law. But when you veer away from the bail bond scenario, there aren't, there's a problem. What's the paperwork? How do you do it? This, that, and the other thing. So what we really need to do is embark upon top to bottom training so the paperwork is available, the clerks know what's going on, and the judges are trained in, how they might want to use different types of alternative bail in different situations. And that's something in Judge Littman's speech this past Thursday that he said he was going to make a top priority. So I anticipate it's going to happen.
Now, one thing I believe he can't do is use what we talked about right before this started, risk assessment.
Well, risk assessment is an interesting area. That goes into something that I believe very passionately in, and I mentioned it in my opening statement, which is an expanded use of supervised release. So in the summer of 2014, the mayor comprised this task force. And the beauty of the task force is it involved the court, it involved defense counsel, it involved prosecutors, it involved service providers. So I happen to co-chair the Committee on Arraignments to Disposition, and our primary recommendation involved greatly expanding a supervised release program that would work with a risk assessment instrument. That actually, I have a meeting on October 13th. We have a steering committee where there's going to be a presentation on the tool that we're anticipating using for that would be part of that program. Now, one of the problems in the state of New York, as the Judge Littman hit on, is the fact that we're not supposed to take public safety in consideration, which
so
seems
just to
absurd.
clarify this, so you set bail. You're setting conditions so that for 2 things. 1, so that the person will return to court, and 2, to protect public safety in the meantime. In New York State, the law says you can only consider their likelihood of returning to court. You can't consider public safety when setting
You can
bail.
consider community contacts, you can consider the strength of the charges, but you can't consider public safety directly. So that's been, for those of you who aren't acquainted in this, that's been a real inside baseball, but a serious problem in the state of New York. And actually, Judge Littman has been proposing legislation that would change that law, but so far it is stalled. But with the supervised release model, we are considering, and we will be using, a risk assessment instrument. And one of the things, frankly, that I think we can do in the context of the current law is we could make it a defense-driven model. So, for example, we could put the onus on the defense counsel. So, in other words, has some of the cases that we've heard about tonight, where you have someone who $500 bail is like $500 million bail, and the defense attorney in the supervised release context is standing up in front of the court with a risk assessment tool that the defense attorney feels that despite the significant warrant history, because just so we know what we're talking about here, we do have a lot of nonviolent individuals in Rikers, and we have to deal, I call that like the base of the pyramid. People who have substance abuse problems, people who have a significant warrant history, and they get like a crack residue, a fare evasion, or something like that. And a judge will look at it, but you'll see 6 or 7 warrants, you'll see like a -3 on the CJA. So it ends up, all things being equal, you end up with $500 bail or something, and then the person ends up in jail. But what if we had a risk assessment tool? What if we had some kind of a service assessment or alignment that we could say, you know what, this is a sensible framework, we can take a chance on this individual, we can go with release on recognizance, and I think working with the defense, and I've kind of always conceived it as a defense-driven model, we may be able to deal with this and start introducing this kind of this type of an instrument even without changing state law. Yeah.
So let's take Miguel here. You'd never been to jail before, right?
No.
And you got picked up for this broken taillight, driving with a suspended license. Your license was suspended for an unpaid something or other. So you had a previous warrant.
Yes.
So, Judge,
Well,
you know all this. Are you going to give him $1,000?
No, maybe not $1,000, but it depends.
You're going to give him something.
Well, maybe. It depends on if you're asking in terms of I'm going to look, how long ago was the warrant? What's the circumstances of the case? How serious is the case? what are the community contacts? So I may not, but if I see 5 recent warrants, and that doesn't sound like the case that we're looking at here. If I see something that's what he's talking about is a VTL 511, which is a misdemeanor. It's an unclassified misdemeanor in the vehicle and traffic law. If that's his only case, and he had a warrant from a couple of years ago or a year, I may ROR him. But that's a very individual.
That means release him on his
on
own
recognizance. That's an individual decision made by a judge, and you also, you look at everything you have.
Okay, so I just want to, I was going to come to you.
I didn't know what the rules were.
Like so a good risk assessment tool would look at, how many priors, how many warrants, what were they for, when were they, how old is the defendant. There are some very non-subjective things that you can look at that turn out to be highly predictive. However, is being predictive fair? What about if you are black and you live in a community where which is like every community, blacks are stopped at a much higher rate and get into trouble at a much higher rate. So is that where you were going?
Yeah, you trying to steal my thunder? So here's what I'm struggling with. First of all, if Miguel got locked up when I got locked up, it would have been a joke, right? He probably wouldn't have even gotten locked up. Because the system had people churning through it with more significant crimes, right? Yeah, 20 years ago. And so he wouldn't have even gone through the system. And yet we built this criminal justice system that has a mind of its own at this point and no one in the driver's seat. And so if you sit in the arraignment part today, you hear a lot of Miguel's stories going through over and over. And as someone who went through the system 20-something years ago, when I go down there and sit there, I'm just appalled at the fact that the system has sort of found a way to keep itself going without being thoughtful about whether someone like Miguel poses any risk at all. And when we talk about using a risk assessment tool, my concern is that the very factors that we use to determine risk, things like jobs and housing and community support, tend to turn those tools into something that have race and class bias inherently built into them. And I see you sitting up, Judge. I'm gonna.
I'm just stretching.
Okay, cool.
My wife's here. She'll make sure I stay seated.
Right, I didn't mention that. There are also some risk assessment tools have used highly subjective factors. Are you married? Do you have a landline? Do you have a house? Or is homelessness by itself a risk?
Yeah. So I always try to get us to take a step back, right? Because the criminal justice system begins and ends with risk. And policymakers and decision makers have the least appetite for it. And I sort of understand why. I mean, if I were a player in the system, I'm not even sure how much appetite I would have for the sort of risk involved with making a decision and having it go terribly wrong. And I think a big part of that is that we're not very thoughtful about the values that currently underlie our criminal justice system. I think we've abandoned things like parsimony and proportionality and social justice and citizenship and some of the things that we should be thinking about when people get involved in the system. And what we have left is punishment. Punishment is the paradigm that we look at. And so even when you build alternatives to detention, alternatives to incarceration, if you look at mass incarceration nationally and here in New York, what happens is most things have grown alongside each other. So yes, the amount of people in prison has grown, the amount of people in jail has grown, but also the amount of people in alternatives to incarceration, alternatives to detention, drug and alcohol treatment. So the system has a life of its own in that even the things that are meant to be alternative, people end up in those programs. Why? Because the system has no appetite for risk. So if you're sitting in a court and you're offering a program to a young man that I would otherwise send home, why wouldn't I put him or her in that program? And what's the problem with that? You net widen. Because now if he or she fails in that program, that person is probably facing even more punishment when they come back before me if I were a judge.
Can I just say, I mean, in my experience, that's often been true. That's very often been true, and it puts us in, not that there should be some pity for us or anything, but it puts us in this very difficult situation sometimes of wanting to tell someone to, say, be in a program, right, or to embrace this opportunity to have some kind of services, and knowing that if they were to fail, their punishment would be greater than what it would be if they simply disposed of the case, right? And that irony is a really uncomfortable one deal with, I think. Can I say one other thing? I want to say something about arraignments, which is the time really in the start of every case when the bail determination that the judge is talking about gets made. And, I really like the idea of regular bail review, because the fact of the matter is that at the beginning of the case, no one knows very much about it. What we've got is I have a client and we have a bunch of pieces of paper. That's what we have. We don't really have witnesses. We don't really have evidence. There's nothing like that. And so, in my experience, as cases grow, they invariably get more complex, and they always get more complex when you meet a person who's accused of something, and they always get more complex when you really see how a case develops. And we have there's been this kind of bizarre convention that I have never quite understood, which is that a lot of the judges that sit in arraignments are new judges. And maybe it's because it's not that much fun, or maybe because sometimes it's from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m., or I don't know. But those new judges don't always, I think sometimes a real premium is put on efficiency for them. And they don't necessarily know what often happens to cases over the life of the case. And the fact of the matter is a heck of a lot of cases end up being dismissed because they're not particularly valid arrests. Or because a complainant doesn't want to follow through, or one reason or another. So we end up making what, at least in the case of a misdemeanor, is the most absolutely critical decision about what's going to happen in a case, namely whether bail gets set or not, before anyone really knows that much about it.
And Josh, is the public defender is there at the arraignment?
Yeah, absolutely.
And can you argue for a change to the bail setting at that point?
Well, arraignment is when bail gets set.
So you have,
and we definitely would argue.
Mr. Padilla and the judge, and Judge Grasso says, well, I think $1,000 is a little harsh. I'll give you $500. And he's, I don't have $500. Can you then argue at that moment?
Yeah, of course.
And how often does that work? How does that go?
That depends a lot on who's on the bench. I guess, it depends a lot on who's on the bench, and it depends a lot on how many defendants are in the system. One of the, I think, really uncomfortable realities of this is that we're talking about singular incidents, right? An alleged offense that are really extremely complicated and have all of these different variables, people's history and all sorts of things that go into them. And but when you've got to make 150 determinations about that in a night, I don't envy a judge, So there's a real pressure for speed that is, in some sense, difficult to reconcile with justice. And
Judge, do you think that how much money Miguel has should come into your mind at all? Should you be considering, $500 for him is still just as unaffordable as $1,000?
Absolutely, you should consider it. And as somebody who did 138 arraignments today, I think we can, and then got on the subway out of here. I think I'd like to, right, Shirley? I think I'd like to connect a couple of dots here. So, first of all, when we talk about speed, we have to keep it in this context. As you mentioned at the outset, I was put in charge of the arraignments for this. We used to have times in Brooklyn. We have Brooklyn attorneys. We used to typically 30 hours as opposed to under 24 hours. Now we have Brooklyn at 20 hours run. So what does that mean? Well, that means people who otherwise might spend a night in jail just because they didn't get in front of a judge. So this isn't just efficiency for efficiency's sake. This is a right, okay? So it's a very important concept. So the key is information. So to go to Glenn's point about the assessment tool, I understand absolutely about the net widening, but that's why it was so important on our task force that we had such a strong defense component. And my theory is, and we'll see how it may play out, and I think it may play out, is to go with the defense-driven model. So, for example, the risk assessment tool won't come to the attention of it unless a lawyer like Josh, who's looking at something, says, look, my client's going to get $500 unless I've got something more I can add. And then the decision can be made that, look, Judge, even though there was 3 warrants in this history, X, Y, and Z, we have a basis here, a scientific basis that you can take a chance on this person and the person can come back to. So the more information.
And then what happens to that person? They go into a program instead of going to jail? Or you're saying?
Basically what we're contemplating with the supervised release concept is that at a minimum, they would be directed to have some sort of a behavioral assessment subsequent to the arraignment. So, in other words, let's say their only issue is maybe they need insurance and we could sign them up for Medicaid. Or maybe there's some sort of a substance abuse issue. At least they would agree to an assessment. And this is all in lieu of and participate in some kind of a supervised regimen. So a judge, him or her, they can hang their hat on something, even though there's a -3 on the CJA report. I'm not going to set $500 bail. I'm going to take a chance on this person. I'm going to release them on recognizance. And I think we should take into consideration the means or lack thereof of the defendant in making that kind of a determination. And more information in certain circumstances can be very useful.
But you are also giving that person a lot of conditions that they have to meet, and if they don't meet them, they're in trouble.
Well, what we're really doing is we're putting the defense counsel in a position to have more arguments to make as to why we should release somebody that otherwise, because of their history, when we are talking about people, it is not uncommon that we're looking at cases, not with 4 or 5 priors, 30, 40, 50 priors. With 5 or 6, so that yes, I mean, if somebody's going to expect a release on recognizance, and maybe a warrant as recently as 3 or 4 months ago, what's the basis going to be to just take a chance on that person? You're going to need some information. You're going to need some framework, I think, anyway.
All right, let's let Glenn
I just want to tell a story real quick because, first of all, anything that gets a person through the system more quickly, I think, is important. And again, 20 years ago, it was 3 days, 4 days.
I remember that. I remember that well.
So I think that is important. But I want to tell a story because if you're in this room and you don't understand the criminal justice system and you're thinking about it at the point where someone is standing in front of a judge, it's hard to figure out sort of the background story and how people sort of end up in that situation. So when I was the vice president at the Fortune Society, one of the largest alternative to incarceration and reentry programs in New York City, I worked there for 6.5 years, and we'd have these clients that were in our alternative to incarceration program. So they were there specifically to avoid usually more than 2 years at least in jail or prison. Those are the folks we'd identify, we'd go in front of a judge, and we'd make a case with the defense attorney and with the prosecutor buying in and the judge signing off to have that person come to our program. So it was in Long Island City, and when these young folks would leave our program, they would walk down the block and walk into the subway, and some of them would swipe their Metro card, and if there's no money left on it, they would toss it on the floor. Half of New Yorkers do that, except there were a lot of young, rookie NYPD officers down there in the subway. And what they would do is they would focus on the right staircase, because that's where the Fortune clients came down, and ignore the left staircase where the high school students came down. Mostly white, mostly Asian. But what's important about that is that if you get the Fortune clients, they already have a conviction on their record. And if you're a police officer, you're not going to write a desk appearance ticket for a person who has a record. You're going to take them to the precinct, and you're going to log overtime for taking them to the precinct. So these clients were unfairly targeted, I would argue. Granted, they broke the law, right? So they were littering, they were spitting on the subway, whatever, you name it. Things that many, many New Yorkers do. Things that those kids coming down from high school were doing. And those are the sort of practices that make it so that people end up standing in front of judges repeatedly. So when I hear that a person has 30 misdemeanors, granted, they may have done things wrong, but we have a criminal justice system in New York that unfairly targets very specific New Yorkers. And I feel as though that must be taken into account as we think about how to redesign our criminal justice system. And risk is important. I get it. And again, I don't begrudge the judge for the decisions that he has to make day to day. But I think as New Yorkers, we need to figure out what sort of criminal justice system we want to operate in our names.
Can I say something about supervised release? Which, obviously this is a thing to explore, and anything is better than putting people in jail. Of course that is true, than putting people in cages, right? Because that's what we're talking about, is putting people in cages. So none of the people that the bail fund has bailed out are recommended for release. None, right? And of those people, 97% have returned to their court dates, okay? They are not part of supervised release. They are not being drug tested. They are not part of a program.
And they're not necessarily nonviolent offenders, is that right?
That's right. I mean, they're all misdemeanors. You know, we can only post for misdemeanors. But so I do think that there is a danger here, right? Because understandably, no judge wants to be on the front page of the Post, right? Understandably, that is true. And I think that it's probably a pretty human instinct to cover, to cover your own behind as much as you possibly can, right? For all of us. And I really fear that that having that kind of option be as widespread as it could be would simply lead to fewer people just being released outright. And, you know, at least in our experience and the kind of data that we're generating in the bail fund, 97% of those people came back. So what I think that demonstrates is that people want to fight their court cases. And they don't necessarily need to have a financial incentive, and they don't necessarily need to have monitoring that they may or may not need. Remember, those are people who are innocent, right? Imagine being arrested of a crime that you are profoundly innocent of and being told by a judge that for you to be released, you need to be drug tested and you need to have a curfew and you need to check in with them every 3 weeks or
Well, the
something.
program I'm talking
Right.
about doesn't have drug testing built in and all of that.
It's just
At least
gonna give
not
people
that we're
Medicaid.
considering now, although not that, you know, that couldn't be part of another protocol. But I think as we think through these issues, we shouldn't discuss these various alternatives such as bail funds, supervised release, alternate forms of bail. These aren't mutually exclusive.
That's true.
I think that the foundation of consensus is, and certainly the way I look at the issue, at the base of the pyramid. You know, we're not talking necessarily about the serious felon. At the base of the pyramid, the crack residue, the crack and heroin residue cases, the fare beats, the pettit larcenies, that we have thousands of people that in a given year end up on bail, end up incarcerated pre-trial. And I think if we connect all of these dots, you know, with the Chief Judge Littman, he's talked about the bail review. So if that works properly, that can operate, that's another stopgap measure within 10 days from the initial arraignment. So it gives counsel a whole variety of options. You know, you may want to line up your own regimen for a particular defendant that you're comfortable with and your client is comfortable with. You might want to go into the supervised release. You might want to focus on an partially unsecured or secured bail. Now you have more time to make the argument. So I think we need to think broadly. This isn't mutually exclusive, and we have to operate in the context of a state system, the legislative system that is far from ideal. And the only way we begin to get where we want to get is to think more broadly, and then to go back to the point that I spoke about earlier, I think, which is crucial. Besides, you know, whether or not it's going to be this point or that point, what is the criminal justice system about? You know, I think that what we've kind of defaulted into, especially from those times that you talk about 20 years ago, when we had a city with 2,300 murders and climbing, over 10,000 shootings in a year. You know, we lived through that. But now it's different. Now it's different. It's gone way down. So we can all take a deep breath. We can take a half a step back, and we can rethink what is our criminal justice system supposed to be about. I think we kind of defaulted into a punishment mechanism when we kind of like in focusing on punishment and coercive authority, we moved away from the concept of what's just and what's right. And I think if we start thinking about that as a system, court, prosecutors, defense counsel, service providers, then we can get closer to where we want to be.
All right, I would like to hear from Miguel one more time, and then we're going to open it up for questions. But Miguel, who, by the way, was only in jail for 10 days, and that was long enough for him to lose 2 jobs before he got to his bail review. The new bail review will take place within 10 days. I just wanted to ask you, this is something I hear from readers quite a bit. You know, the stories that I write about people who have similar experiences to yours, they raise a lot of controversy, they get a lot of comments, and they can be very polarizing. And one thing I hear is you know, if that person didn't want to go to Rikers, get assaulted, get into a gang initiation, leave their kids, lose their jobs, well, they just shouldn't have done anything wrong. They shouldn't have committed a crime. What would you say to a person who said that to you?
I don't. Sorry. It's rough. How can I explain? It's just. I wouldn't want a person to go through what I went through, in that sense of a matter, because it's traumatizing. Like, you go through so much. Like, a lot of people out here, they say, like, they hear about jail, but they don't actually experience it. And to actually experience it and go through what you go through, like, I went through a lot of racism, like, people just picking me out of a crowd, because it's like what he said, you're the person bullying or the person that's gonna get bullied. So it's like, I try to stay away from it all, but it's like, no matter how far I kept myself away from it, it kept coming at me, you know? I don't know if it makes any sense, but
Did that experience change him permanently?
yeah, it did, because I just wanted to speak to my wife at one point, and I asked the CO officer, I said, Miss, is there any way I can make a phone call? And she just looks at me, and I will never forget this. She just looks at me like if I was nothing, and she tells me, oh, you're a disgrace to our heritage. And I told the lady, I said, well, you don't even know what I'm here for. You're not in my shoes, like, you don't know why I'm here. Why are you treating me like if I killed someone, or, you know, like if I hurt someone? And she just looked at me, she just turned her back and didn't want nothing to do with me. You understand? And it sucks, it hurts. Like, I still feel it now, you know, like, not to be able to talk to my family, like, it killed me. I'm sorry, people, I'm sorry. But it's rough to know that you're about to go home and then have people wanting to hurt you because they know that you're about to be free and they have to stay in there. So they want to hurt you just so that you can, you know, it's I'm sorry.
And that wouldn't have happened if you'd had $500,
No.
right? I mean, it's like, to me, it's like, that's the question, why is this the factor that makes the difference in whether you have that experience or not, you know? Why is that?
All right, let's open it up for questions from the audience, please. I think there's a mic. Yes, a mic is going to come to you if you raise your hand. You can pick them out.
In my experience, which is considerable, Miguel's bail, $1,000 for a suspended license, is grotesquely anomalous. I have almost never seen, I have rarely seen bail set at all on such a charge. A bail of Miguel's type would be set if there are some extraordinary additional circumstances that were before the court that would cause that kind of bail to be set. A disposition on this charge would almost never result in a criminal conviction. So I would say there must have been, I don't know why a criminal conviction resulted in this kind of charge on Miguel's part. The only thing I can think of, and a problem that I see with anomalous bails being set, especially on nonviolent criminals, is basically judicial misfeasance or malfeasance. Why some judge who's acting rationally and humanely would set this kind of bail for this kind of charge is beyond me. And with respect to the fact that 70% of detainees are nonviolent, charged with shoplifting and trespassing and crime, so those of that nature, what does it matter if they have bench warrants? What does it matter if there's a high risk of them not going to court? returning to court, given the fact that these charges are of such inconsequential nature, who cares? Release them, they come back, great. They don't come back, so what?
And I think that's how it used to be. I mean, a judge wasn't that way for some time. Lots of people never
Well,
showed
look,
up for court, and
I-
nothing ever happened to them.
I hear the comment, but that is by law. A judge's determination is guided by the criminal procedure law, and whether or not, who cares, is the state legislature and our judicial and our framework of law. So whether or not someone comes back to court is a significant factor that I consider routinely, and I think just about every other judge considers. Now, should that be devoid of how serious is the charge? Absolutely not. But is it a consideration? Absolutely.
Can I say something about this? I think there is, and I can't speak to this history as much, obviously, as you can, Judge, but I've, a lot of people have sort of told me, and judges included, that one of the things we've seen is, and I think Miguel's case is illustrative of this on some level, is just this increasing kind of criminalization of behavior that, if it wasn't previously non-criminal, definitely would not have resulted in an arrest. The first 5 years of my career, I never saw a person who was arrested for going between cars in the subway, right? I never saw that. And I think that, a lot of the kinds of arrests that we're talking about, all kinds of taking up 2 seats on the subway, right? Driving without a license, littering, trespassing, these very nonviolent arrests are things that we just see more and more of. And that seems like something to be concerned about, right? Because it creates this question, which is, where is there an incentive to make all of these arrests that might not previously have happened? I had an experience. This will be a really short story, I promise. But I had a client, a woman, first arrest years ago, who was arrested for smoking marijuana on her stoop. And it was late at night, and I was real mad, and I was young and mad. And I went into the back, and I found the officer who had brought her in, because she was a medical, so she'd been accompanied by an officer. And I said, what is going on here? Why was this person arrested? And he said to me, and I thought this was really remarkable, and he said to me, if I had made this arrest 20 years ago, my sergeant would have punched me in the face and said, get out in the street and make an real arrest. But now, I will do this until I get my own stripes on my arm. And what was I going to say, right? Like, this was a very honest explanation of why he had made that arrest.
Hi. There are all sorts of crimes that are class-based, that's for sure. And I take the point that a lot of that class-based criminality is race-based as well. I take that totally. But I'm wondering about this. There are some things that we all agree by consensus are crimes, that are crimes against people, that hurt people. And I'm wondering when, if ever, pretrial detention, in the view of especially you, sir, you, is appropriate. Thanks.
You being Glenn? Me?
Yes, I do.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. And I wonder if every time you say victim in your mind, you think of a black man. Because in this country, the most prevalent victim of crime is black men. And we don't have that discussion, so I'm glad you actually brought it up. And I think if we spent as much time as if we spent as much time being so passionate about helping black men when they're victims of crime, maybe the trauma that they experience wouldn't calcify and turn into offending behavior when it seems we're suddenly ready to spend $167,000 per year to lock them up. Do I think that some people should be locked up? Yeah. In my case, I should have been locked up. I went to prison for robbery. I went to Rikers Island for robbery. But you know what I met there? A lot of people who were there for bullshit. And so that's why I speak about it loudly. And yes, I do believe in having a criminal justice system where some people need to be incapacitated. I'm not a prison abolitionist. And at the same time, that's not what exists in our criminal justice system. And you know what? The last thing I'll say is I didn't learn how to pull out a gun on people until someone pulled out a gun on me. And maybe if my community, or maybe if Brooklyn would have shown some interest in it at that point, it wouldn't have turned into that sort of behavior. Maybe not. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
Sorry, I really didn't. My question is when, if ever, is pretrial detention?
Pretrial detention versus bail?
Right.
I mean, if you look at the Washington, D.C. model, the majority of people actually leave on pretrial detention. I think that there are just the many things that you should take into account if there's going to be a pretrial detention opportunity. I think in New York City now, we have a fund that's going to lead to pretrial detention. I'm not sure if I understand the question. I mean, if people pose a risk to public safety, an immediate risk, I think they should be detained. Beyond that, beyond depriving them of their liberty, this type of punishment that happens on Rikers Island, I think is unnecessary. I mean, I appreciate.
And how do we know when they pose a risk?
I think a person's criminal record tells a story about their behavior. So if you're I mean, I'm trying not to read into the question. I mean, is the question that you're assuming that I think that no one should be detained? Because that's not the case. I think there are situations where people deserve to be detained. I mean, I was detained with pretty high bail by the 8th time I was locked up. But the argument that I'm making is that there were many times before when there were many other things that could have happened that wouldn't have continued to lead to me going back over and over and over again. I mean, I think that arguably in a city of 9 million people, we could get away with 4,000, 3,500 beds, decentralized between Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and close down Rikers Island and still achieve public safety and lock up people who need to be locked up.
I mean, let's not forget that we are the world leader in incarceration, right? You know, the United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. So, you know, are there people who need to be incarcerated? Sure, but are we also all participating in this kind of diseased fiction that the way we solve problems that are social problems or economic problems or public health problems is by putting people in cages? I think we're doing that too.
Yeah, I just want to say something too, just from my own reporting and sitting in a lot of municipal courthouses and watching what's going on. There are, for example, there are a lot of domestic violence cases. Many. I mean, it's like shoplifting, domestic violence, drunk driving. That's most of your cases. So, but you look at these domestic violence cases, that's a very serious offense. Most people think that domestic violence is very serious. I think maybe 60-70% of these domestic violence cases are bullshit. 90% are bullshit. They're either somebody's getting revenge or the neighbors called the cops. The couple just got drunk and got mad at each other. It's very hard for a judge to tell the bullshit from, a real threatening, stalking, coercive, gonna lead to worse situation. So these are the kinds of problems you have when you start to try to figure out who should be detained.
And I think it's not so easy to just dismiss the racial impact of the criminal justice system. I mean, the question sort of suggested, yeah, I get that there's race issues, but I mean, I have a father who was a police officer his entire life till he retired. My older brother's a U.S. correction officer for 10 years, and now he's a U.S. Marshal. Like, I get the position of law enforcement and the job they have to do. I get that people are really harmed. At the same time, I mean, the most successful and long-lasting diversion program in this country has been white skin. And we have not had a conversation about whether people are going to come back.
Is there a woman who wants to ask a question?
So
You're not a woman.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll allow this. No, I'm kidding.
Given this is actually a really serious practical question for all of you. Given that you have 97% appearance rates, the bail fund sounds like a terrific thing, but it just reaches a small number of people and up to a small amount. Where do you draw that upper limit? And if you don't draw the limit, right, if there's no limit to where you don't trust people really showing up at that rate, what's the obstacle to ending money bail in New York State?
Lobby.
Yeah, what's the obstacle? I think that's sort of a legislative question that's beyond my beyond my knowledge, frankly. At least I don't know if other people have more sophisticated ideas about it. I mean, I think our bail fund and the Bronx Defenders has a similar bail fund that predated ours, have really shown, I think, that people overwhelmingly come back to court without a financial incentive to do so, or without other particular strictures other than reminders, and to be frank, sometimes Metro cards. I'm sorry to say that a lot of the times when my clients don't make it to their court dates, it's because they don't have the money to get a Metro card to get there. So I think that affects return rates. But I can't speak to the legislative.
Yeah, and it is a legislative issue. I mean, that was the impetus for Judge Littman's remarks. He has tried to spearhead legislation to change the bail system, and it's gone nowhere in the state. So, the question is how do we connect the dots? Another thing we haven't talked about yet that the Chief Judge mentioned was the a pilot electronic monitoring project that's going to be starting in New York County Criminal Court that will be designed for people where bail has already been set. It'll exclude domestic violence and sex crime cases, and it'll create one more option for the court to take someone who had a bail status and put them into a non-bail status, and as long as they comply with the electronic monitoring parameters, and we'll be watching that as well. So basically, it goes back to my original point. In the context, we could spend a lot of time talking about, the laws we'd like to have, the situation, but, where are we now? What can we do now? And I think that the discussion that we had tonight, especially some of the personal examples, really speak to situations that we absolutely can and should reach now and come up with a plethora of alternatives to cash bail, working in the current statutory framework.
Okay, so let's just take this. I think where the previous question was going, which is, so in Brooklyn, if somebody was just trying to raise money for the bail fund, how much money would it take to, have enough to give everybody who's in that probable 97% coming back category bail?
To bail out everyone that we could. I am not the person who's the best with these numbers. I'm sure that if you asked Peter about it after, he would be happy to tell you. But I think the short answer is a lot. I think like $1 million is kind of roughly what we computed.
Well, if you have 50,000 people going to Rikers a year because they can't, 50,000 because they can't make bail, let's say they all owe $1,000, that's $500,000.
Yeah, I think it's
Roughly,
probably a little
very rough.
more complicated, however. And I think Peter would say that because I think even because the bail fund replenishes itself also, right? But I think you have to get licensed, all right? And I think that takes some time. I just think
Although I
it's more
did
complicated.
learn the other day, do you know this, that there are some community bail funds that are non-licensed or very specific, like Latina sex workers in the Bronx have a community bail fund where they bail each other out.
It limits the amount of posting they can do.
Yeah,
so
it's very
the
limited,
law
but-
is you can only post for a misdemeanor, and you can only post for an amount that's less than $2,000. And if you're not licensed, you can only post twice a month. Right? If you are licensed, you can post much more.
But the answer to the earlier question about what's in the way, no one has said it out loud. I'll say it out loud. There's a bail lobby.
Yeah. Yep.
Bail bondsmen have a very strong lobby, and they give money to our elected officials here in New York State, which influences their decision making.
Does someone have a mic back there? Okay, who's got the mic?
Brown person has the mic. Hi, my name is May. Thank you so much for being here and shedding light to the system, this particular level of the system. my brother over here talked about Rikers and the essence of Rikers being so soiled that you need to get rid of it and you can't reform it. There's no way to reform it. And thanks to incredible young women of color, we are, through the Black Lives Matter movement and through the immigrant rights movement, we've been seeing, we've been shining light on the culture of the police systems all over this nation. And I, in my own work in DC, have seen how officers join the force with the best of intentions and are corrupted and changed by the system into folks that we might not necessarily be proud of. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the other end of the system, not your end, but what happens to folks that go in to be cops, to do good, to serve and protect, and end up building biases, and end up targeting certain types of folks that tend to be people of color and young people and poor people. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and if you see this system as being able to change and improve, or is that just like the Riker system you were describing, needing to go?
I'm sorry, was that question directed at a specific person, Glenn?
Everyone, but specifically
To me? Okay, I'll respond. So first of all, I think the work that Black Lives Matters folks are doing around this country is a big part of the renewed impetus that we have on criminal justice reform. I think power concedes nothing without a demand, and there's a huge demand being made by young people who are risking their lives every day in this country through that movement. I think systems change people long before people change systems, unfortunately. And I think of two stories, both brief. One is my older brother, who, again, went into the military, went into law enforcement, became a correctional officer, and then became a U.S. Marshal. And I remember getting out of prison, and the first thing he said to me was, I don't know how we grew up in the same household, and you ended up like that, and I ended up like this. Until a few years later, after he came back from a war, and he slapped his wife and got locked up for domestic violence, and I had to be the one to find a diversion program for veterans to get him out. And yet, at the same time, having a brother who grew up in the same space I grew up in, and noticing how his narrative that sort of, that he had developed that made it easy for him to go to work every day and do his job was so different than the one my younger brother and I, who both got locked up, had to live with. The other one was a correction officer in New York State when I was leaving, who said to me, you being here helped me get my boat, and when your son gets here, he's going to help my son get his boat. And I think that that statement was difficult to hear. He said it very matter-of-factly in the middle of a conversation where he was actually wishing me well on my way out. But what it reminded me is that we have created a criminal justice system that really supports many, many Americans moving from poverty into the middle class. I mean, there are prisons all across this country and jails that if they didn't exist, those communities would essentially dry up. And those prisons have become economic engines for those communities and everything else that comes with it. I think that's why we can sit here in New York and decide that while we want to have more money for schools, that we're okay having Rikers Island, where we're just wasting money, hundreds of thousands of dollars each bed each year. And yet, I think that that is so because we have a lot of people who benefit from that island continuing to operate. And it's actually my hope that we have more, if this is the way we're going to get there, to have more diversion programs, more pre-child programs, so that we get the numbers down, so it actually ends up being $300,000 per bed per year, because that seems to be the only thing that motivates most decision makers, unfortunately. I hope that's not how we get there. I hope we get there because we realize we're doing something wrong, but I do think that some of these opportunities are other ways to get there.
Do you want to answer that since you were a police officer?
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, if we want to talk in a broad context of public safety, it's remarkable. People don't appreciate how far the city has come in a generation. So, you know, like just looking at my own, as I said earlier, 36 years, I started when it was 1,000, 1,100, 1,200 murders, commensurate number. I mean, we had the 75th precinct One precinct in Brooklyn would get close to 120 murders in a year. Today, that's about a third of what the entire city of New York with 76 precincts is going to have. So, we've come a long way in public safety. So I think that gives the mayor, that gives Commissioner Braden, that gives, our civil authorities an opportunity to think in terms of a reset, in terms of our training, in terms of our tactics. Thank God this isn't 1990. So, what you're saying, we want our officers to be idealistic, and we want them to do the right thing. But, again, since we're going outside the normal scope, but I think it all ties in some respect. To me, if we're broadening the conversation, one of our most problematic areas as a country when we're talking about violence and violence crime is our total lack of cohesive national gun legislation. I think it's crazy.
Do you think young cops, rookie cops come in with biases, or that the job gives them biases, and can they change?
Well, what I think I heard in the question, and we can answer the question, is that young cops come in idealistic and wanting to do the right thing, and that the job over time and the experiences in the job can change them in the wrong way. Is that what the question was? That's how I heard the question. Right.
My experience in DC, and I was working with in an organization that worked with sex workers and drug users, and what I saw was that the young cops that were starting with the Metro Police were really invested in helping the community.
Well, that's
and
what I
serving.
thought I heard you say.
And
yes, that's what
it's not necessarily the experiences of the job, but the system, the police departments.
And the system itself over time
Right.
jaded them.
So my question is, just like you said, the person to your right, that we can't reform Rikers, we need to get rid of Rikers. Right now, there's so many movements that are bringing to light the biases and the corruption of police departments all over this nation. So my question is, do we need to completely redo the system because it's obviously very broken and biased against a certain group of people, or can we take steps to make sure that those cops that have been in power, because it is a power game for 10, 15, 20 years, and are not following the rules, are not arresting their fellow Marines that, beat their wives in a domestic abuse. So is the system salvageable, or?
Well, you're hitting a lot of areas, but I think that in terms of talking about idealistic officers, whether it's New York, Metro, Seattle, who's ever in charge, who's ever running law enforcement, who's ever the civil authority is, you want to do everything you can to maintain that, support that, and inculcate that. As far as systemic change, we've heard, some very big ideas tonight, and I can certainly understand, where Glenn is coming from when he talks about a wholesale change to incarceration. But I think even Glenn would have to admit, even if we were to hypothetically agree, for argument's sake, well, that would be a good thing, which I don't know, I hear him, but, we don't see that happening anytime soon, So someone who believes and is passionate, has experience, advocates.
But, Judge?
Well, I don't know. We'll see. But there's what we aspire to in terms of broad change, and then there's the here and now. So I think we have to think in stereo. Sure, we have to aspire, and we have to debate, and we have to think big picture, but we also, on a parallel track, we need to think about what can and should we do right now to make things better.
Can I say something, or are we?
Yes, no.
So, just to speak to the question a little bit,
You can say a short thing.
I'll say a short thing. One of the experiences that my clients used to tell me about all the time was the experience of being arrested in a public housing project, right? And folks would get charged with trespassing, right? And almost invariably they either actually lived in the building or they lived in the building next door or they were visiting someone in the building, right? And there are these protocols that at least my clients told me often were just not followed by police. And what would happen is they would they would be put into a van, right? They would be put into a police van, a paddy wagon, and they would sit there for like 4 hours. And they would say to the officers who arrested them, what is going on? Like, take me to the precinct if you're gonna arrest me, despite the fact that my aunt lives in this building and I was trying to visit her, whatever, take me to the precinct. And the response that they got, which I think was an honest one, was, we gotta fill up the van, right? That was the response. And so, I think that we, bracketing the question of what the effectiveness of broken windows policing has been, we need to think seriously about what the consequences of it are now, right? Because we have a system that seems to really radically incentivize quantity of arrests. And that has extremely damaging consequences, both for the rest of the criminal justice system, I think, and obviously for the relationships between officers and over-policed communities that are invariably communities of color, right? And I think that is kind of part of the process that you're talking about on all sides. So I think we need to think seriously about that part of it, about that end of it also.
All right. Thank you guys so much. You've been a really great audience.